You've watched Game of Thrones, the betrayals, the backroom alliances, the blood-stained weddings, the ruthless rise and catastrophic falls of noble houses. You've seen castles burning, kings kneeling, and entire families wiped out in one long night. But what if I told you that was the soft version? Because in medieval Europe, from the cold highlands of Scotland to the sun-scorched hills of Sicily, a very real Game of Thrones was being played. And it was far crueler, far more chaotic, and no one was writing the script. This was the world of the feudal lords, men who weren't kings but acted like it. They owned land, commanded private armies, issued local laws, and built their own stone fortresses, not just to protect their people, but to prepare for the inevitable day when their neighbors turned on them. In this world, power was everything, but power never stood still. It shifted like a shadow with every marriage, every birth, every sword drawn or sheath snapped shut. You could be a favored lord one day and a rebel hunted by your own king the next. Loyalty, a word on parchment, burned the moment it became inconvenient. Love, a useful tool until the alliance it created no longer served. Peace, nothing but a pause between sieges. And the stakes, they were never just about land. They were about legacy, lineage, and the right to pass your name down through stone, blood, and battle. To be a feudal lord was to live in a world where your next feast could also be your final one. Where your daughter's hand in marriage might win you a fortress or lose you your head. Where knights swore fealty in the morning and helped storm your gate by dusk. This was not a fantasy novel. This was medieval reality. And it was messier, bloodier, and more treacherous than anything you've seen on TV. So forget the dragons, forget the magic, because in the real Middle Ages, the only fire was from burning castles. And the only prophecy was who would blide next. Welcome to the true Game of Thrones. Now let's meet the players. Before we dive into battles and betrayals, we need to understand one thing. What exactly was a feudal lord? Because unlike kings or knights, feudal lords didn't wear golden crowns or charge into war for glory. They ruled from the shadows, built power piece by piece, and often acted as kings within their own lands. Let's rewind to the heart of medieval Europe around the 9th to 14th centuries. After the fall of Rome, central power fractured, no more emperors overseeing everything from one capital. The continent splintered into duchies, counties, baronies, each ruled by local warlords turned landowners, and each fiercely protective of their slice of the world. This was the birth of feudalism, a system built on land, loyalty, and leverage. A feudal lord was someone who controlled land, lots of it, but more than that, he controlled the people on it. Peasants worked his fields, knights rode under his banner, priests prayed in chapels built by his coin. And while he technically owed allegiance to a king, in practice, the king often had little say over what happened within the lord's domain. Imagine this, a valley surrounded by mountains, a stone castle perched above winding farms. Hundreds of families laboring daily not for wages but for protection. A private army garrisoned behind high walls, courts held in the lord's name, taxes collected by his men if the king died or war broke out. This lord didn't wait for orders, he made his own. In the medieval mind, land was power, and land didn't change hands easily. It was inherited through blood or seized by the sword. And because land meant food, wealth, soldiers, and influence, every feud, marriage, and alliance became a game of strategic survival. But lords weren't just landlords. They were judges, generals, and patriarchs. They dispensed justice, sometimes fair, often brutal. They led men into battle not for nation or ideology, but for family name and honor. They arranged marriages like chess moves, forging bloodlines across regions. And sometimes they raised rebellion not out of ambition, but because to survive, you had to strike before being struck. Feudal lords came in many forms, dukes, who ruled vast regions nearly as powerful as kings. Barons who controlled smaller lands but often served as political kingmakers. Counts and earls who held court in castles and kept rival lords at bay with threats and treaties alike, each with their own banners, their own laws. Their own enemies, and while some played the game through politics, others played it through force, raiding villages, burning rival estates, or holding hostages to negotiate power. There were no international courts, no appeals. Only who had the bigger army, the stronger alliance, the sharper dagger. So when we speak of feudal lords, we don't mean quaint nobles sipping wine and watching tournaments. We mean stone-hearted strategists, ruling by fear and favor, surrounded by walls and whispers. And in the next chapter, we'll see how birthright alone was never enough. Because in the feudal world, if you wanted to rule, you had to bleed for it. To be born into a noble house in medieval Europe wasn't a blessing. It was a burden wrapped in silk, heavy with legacy, and soaked in centuries of blood. From the moment a noble child drew their first breath, they weren't just someone's son or daughter, they were a pawn, a promise, a weapon. Their life, their marriage, their loyalty, their death would never truly belong to them. Because in the world of feudal lords, bloodline was currency, and every relationship was a transaction. Imagine a 7-year-old boy who doesn't play in the courtyard, but is sent to another lord's castle as a page. He's not there just to learn chivalry, he's there to cement an alliance. His presence is a hostage wrapped in etiquette. If his father rebels, he might not live to return home. Imagine a 12-year-old girl, betrothed not for love, but for strategy. Her hand in marriage comes with 3 fortresses and a trade route. Her wedding vows seal the fate of entire regions. Her body is not hers, it is a treaty in flesh. This was the reality of noble life. Marriage was war. Children were bargaining chips, and loyalty was often leased, not owned. Noble houses constantly calculated who to align with, who to betray at the right moment. A daughter married to the son of a rival could end a generational blood feud or become the reason it reignited. A cousin's death could open up a new claim to land or create a fresh civil war. Even blood itself wasn't simple. Bastards were threats or tools, depending on the context. Legitimacy could be bought, faked, or revoked. One unsigned scroll could mean the difference between ruling a duchy and rotting in a dungeon. And revenge was not emotional, it was political. If your great uncle had been betrayed by a neighboring baron, you were expected to remember, to plan. Feuds lasted generations, passed down like heirlooms. You didn't just inherit lands, you inherited enemies. Lords had to walk a razor-thin line between tradition and treachery. Too soft, and your rivals would take everything. Too ruthless, and your own bannermen might turn on you. Even at family feasts, every smile was measured, every toast double-edged. You were surrounded by cousins who dreamed of your death, allies who counted your mistakes, spies dressed as servants, and siblings who loved you but loved power more. So when we look at medieval nobles and think of riches and feasts, remember this. Behind the silk robes were bruises from betrayal. Behind the titles were wounds from family knives, and behind every alliance was a silent question. When will they betray me, and can I strike first? In the world of feudal lords, you weren't raised to rule, you were raised to survive. To the modern eye, a medieval castle looks majestic, stone towers silhouetted against the sky. Flags fluttering in the wind, grand halls and sweeping staircases. But in the time of feudal lords, a castle was not a monument of beauty, it was a weapon, a message carved into the land, a vow that said, I will not kneel easily. And if you come for me, be ready to blade. The castle was the beating heart of a lord's power, a place of iron discipline and unspoken fear. It wasn't just where he lived. It was where he commanded, judged, plotted, and protected what was his. Let's start with the walls. Massive, layered, deliberately intimidating, they were designed not just to keep enemies out, but to remind everyone inside who ruled here. Standing before a castle's gate meant submitting to the lord within. It was psychological warfare in stone, drawbridges, murder holes, boiling oil, archery slits, moats. Every inch of a castle was engineered to kill. But inside, the war didn't stop. Inside the walls, the game of power continued in subtler, deadlier ways. The Great Hall wasn't just a banquet room, it was the political stage. Lords received emissaries, held court, settled disputes, forged alliances, and delivered sentences from the head table. One moment, a feast with music and roasted boar. The next, a public hanging just beyond the courtyard. Hospitality and terror served side by side. Above, in the private chambers, secrets were born. Letters written in candlelight, servants bribed, guests watched, and sometimes assassins hidden behind a tapestry. Castles also served as prisons, but not just for criminals, for family. A rebellious brother, lock him in the tower. A daughter refusing a political marriage, isolate her until she agrees. A captured rival lord. Feed him just enough to keep him alive, and to remind his allies what happens when loyalty wavers. Sometimes, the greatest threat to a feudal lord didn't come from outside the walls, but from within them. A garrison paid off by an enemy, a steward loyal to another banner, a guest who drinks from your cup at noon and poisons your goblet by dusk. The castle was also a symbol. When you raised your banner from its highest turret, you were not just claiming land, you were challenging the world. That's why sieges weren't just military campaigns, they were acts of humiliation. To lose your castle was to lose your name. Your bloodline, your pride, which is why most lords would rather burn it to the ground than surrender it. But a castle could be a prison in another way, too. Some lords spent their entire lives behind their own walls, paranoid, calculating, trapped by the very fortress they built to protect them. Because in the feudal world, a castle meant safety, but it also meant everyone knew exactly where to find you. So yes, castles were strongholds, but they were also traps. And for many lords, they became beautiful tombs. Built not just of stone and steel, but of secrets, fear, and blood. In the Middle Ages, a crown didn't guarantee command, a throne didn't ensure obedience. What mattered more than any royal decree was how many swords would ride when you called. Feudal lords were not simply landowners, they were warlords, and their power rested on the backs of private armies, not national armies. Not standing regiments funded by the kingdom, but personal military forces, loyal to one man, one banner, one cause, his survival. When we picture medieval war, we often imagine great national armies marching in polished formation. But the truth was far messier and far more personal. Every lord, from a minor baron to a great duke, kept his own retinue of armed men, household knights sworn to him by oath, mercenaries paid in coin and promises, peasant levies conscripted in times of desperation, and sometimes freelance killers loyal only to silver and steel. These weren't just defenders, they were instruments of power. A strong army could intimidate neighbors, crush rebellion, seize disputed land, or enforce brutal taxes. If a neighboring lord failed to pay tribute or insulted your house in a letter, you didn't sue him, you marched. And when a lord went to war, he didn't ask the king for permission. He sent his heralds, he gathered his vassals, he armed his men. Sometimes it was over a border stone, sometimes a stolen bride. Often it was about revenge. For a raid, for an insult, for a treaty broken 30 years ago. The result, dozens of local wars all happening simultaneously across Europe. Castle versus castle, banner versus banner. A patchwork of mini-conflicts that never made it into royal chronicles but destroyed thousands of lives. These private armies weren't bound by modern rules of war. They burned villages, ransomed prisoners, slaughtered livestock, and pillaged churches if they thought God wouldn't look too closely. Sometimes, lords would deliberately burn their own lands rather than let an enemy profit from them, a tactic known as scorched earth. If they couldn't win, they'd make sure no one else could either. And loyalty, it was fragile. A knight could be bought. A mercenary could change sides mid-battle if the coin was better. Even a bannerman, sworn by blood, could be tempted to betrayal if his cousin offered him a manor and a marriage, which meant that a lord not only had to recruit and train. He had to watch his back every night. War was constant. Peace was a pause to sharpen blades, and in this world your army wasn't just protection, it was your voice, your vote, your worth. A weak lord had no army, and a lord without an army was already a ghost. In stories, a knight kneels and swears fealty. A lord bows before his king and promises loyalty unto death. Oaths are spoken, banners kissed, swords drawn in the name of honor. But in the world of real feudal lords, loyalty was conditional, and death didn't always come from the enemy. It often came from behind. The entire feudal system was built on a web of oaths. Lords swore loyalty to kings. Vassals swore loyalty to lords, knights swore loyalty to their liege, but these weren't heartfelt vows, they were contracts made under pressure, bound in convenience, and often broken the moment they became inconvenient. Why? Because in a world where power meant survival, loyalty was a liability unless it came with leverage. If your king lost a war, you had a choice: die on his side or switch banners before the axe fell. If a stronger neighbor offered your family land and gold in exchange for betrayal. Was it betrayal, or was it a necessary investment in the future of your house? These were not just hypotheticals. They happened over and over again. Some of the most infamous rebellions in medieval Europe weren't led by rebels in the shadows, but by dukes, counts, and earls who had once stood at the king's side and then turned on him for a better deal. Take the case of Robert of Bellarme, a powerful Norman lord in the 11th century. He switched allegiances between the kings of England and France 7 times, each shift calculated to expand his landholdings and preserve his influence. He was feared not just for his cruelty, but for his complete lack of loyalty to anyone but himself. Or consider the War of the Roses, where entire noble houses changed sides mid-conflict. One day you fought for Lancaster. The next, for York. The deciding factor wasn't honor, it was who looked like they were going to win. And that's the brutal truth of feudal politics. No one followed the weak. Loyalty flowed upward only if the top was strong. A king who lost a battle might wake the next morning to find his bannermen gone. A lord who couldn't protect his vassals would find his own knights selling their swords elsewhere. Even within families, loyalty fractured. Brothers betrayed brothers, sons rose against fathers. If your cousin married into a rival house, you might find yourself facing your own blood on the battlefield. And if a promise made today prevented victory tomorrow, it was torn apart without regret. Which is why the most powerful lords learned this early: trust no one completely. Oaths are tools, not truths, and loyalty is a luxury only fools expect for free. So in the real Game of Thrones, the question was, who is loyal? It was, how long will they stay that way? and what will it cost to make them change? Not every battle in the feudal world was fought with steel. Many were fought over wine goblets, behind closed doors, with a glance, a whisper, or a single drop of liquid no one could trace. Because in a world where war was loud, expensive, and bloody, the most dangerous lords learned how to kill quietly, and their deadliest weapons weren't swords. They were marriage contracts, false promises, and poison. In public, a feudal lord might play the part of the gracious host. He'd welcome rivals to his banquet, raise goblets of spiced wine, and toast to peace. But behind the scenes, he'd already paid off a servant to lace the roast duck with nightshade, or instructed a steward to leave a letter open where the wrong eyes could find it. Assassination wasn't dishonorable, it was efficient, it avoided sieges, it avoided scandal, and when done well, it left no one to blame. Poison was especially popular in courts where open war was politically risky. Lords used herbs, powders, and slow-acting toxins to make deaths look natural: a fever, a coughing fit, a sudden stomach pain during the night. Belladonna, arsenic, hemlock, these weren't just plants, they were tools of diplomacy. And many noble households had apothecaries not to heal, but to silence. But intrigue wasn't always fatal. Sometimes it was seductive. Marriage was the most common battlefield of manipulation. A well-placed union could create an alliance, absorb a rival's land, or provide a claim to a contested title. But behind every marriage agreement were secrets, side deals, and power plays. A daughter might be married to an ally, only for the father to betray that ally weeks later, using the union as cover to invade. A widow might be courted, not out of affection, but because her husband died without an heir, and her hand meant inheritance. Some lords even used fake pacts, promising support to one side while secretly funding the other. A betrayal carefully timed could collapse a siege or turn the tide of a rebellion. It wasn't just about armies. It was about information: who knew what, when, and how to use it. Spies were everywhere: a maid in your hall who once worked for your enemy, a scribe copying letters who secretly sent duplicates to another castle, a confessor who reported your fears straight to your rival's ears. No one could be fully trusted, not lovers, not cousins, not even your own sons, because power made liars of everyone. And still, amidst this web of deception, reputation mattered. A clever lord needed to maintain the image of honor, even as he moved pieces in the dark. He couldn't afford to be seen as treacherous; that would isolate him. But if his rival died of a fever days after a peace treaty was signed, well, that was just bad luck, or God's judgment, or so the records would say. In the end, the lords who rose highest weren't always the strongest with the sword. They were the ones who understood that warfare begins long before the gates fall. It begins with whispers, with forged letters, with a poisoned cup handed with a smile, because in the game of lords, those who ruled longest were those who learned how to win without ever drawing a blade. While lords schemed in towers and knights clashed on blood-soaked fields, there was one group that never held a sword, never signed a treaty, never sat at the table, yet paid for every decision made above them. They were the peasants. The farmers, the laborers, the nameless millions who tilled the land, paid the taxes, bore the scars, and bled for wars they never chose. To be a peasant in feudal Europe was to be born into a contract you could never renegotiate. You didn't own your land, you didn't control your life. You owed your labor, your harvest, and your silence to the lord who claimed dominion over your village. And if that lord went to war, so did you. A nobleman might raise an army with the flourish of a banner, but he wasn't the one cutting wood for siege towers or marching barefoot through winter mud. That fell to the peasants, conscripted by force, armed with rusted tools, and thrown into battles where they were cannon fodder centuries before cannons existed. Most had no training, no protection, only the knowledge that if they refused, their homes would burn before the enemy even arrived, and even those who stayed behind weren't safe. When rival lords clashed, villages were often the first targets. Fields were trampled, granaries burned, women violated, cattle stolen or slaughtered. Why? Because to starve your enemy's people was faster than besieging his castle. To destroy his peasants was to destroy his power. Sometimes a peasant village would be caught between two feuding lords. One might demand food, the other men. Refusing either could be labeled treason. Helping one side invited the wrath of the other. And neutrality, there was no such thing. In times of peace, brief and fragile, the burden didn't lessen. Lords still extracted taxes, labor, and obedience. A poor harvest meant starvation unless you had a hidden stash. But if the lord's taxmen discovered you were hiding grain, you could lose your hand or your life, and justice, it belonged to the lord. If his knights trampled your field, you had no right to protest. If his men took your daughter as payment, there was no court to hear your cries. You were a number, a resource, a line in the account books of war. Yet despite all this, it was the peasants who kept the world turning. They fed the armies, built the roads, crafted the weapons, buried the dead. Their names are forgotten, unrecorded in history books. But without them, no lord could rule, no war could be fought, no dynasty could last more than a generation. And perhaps the greatest tragedy of the feudal game wasn't who won or lost, but how many innocents were crushed beneath the boots of men playing it. Because in the real-life Game of Thrones, the throne may change hands, but the suffering stays exactly where it's always been. At the bottom, in the grand halls of stone castles, beneath the stained glass and carved family crests, feudal lords told themselves they were building legacies, forging names that would echo through time. They dreamed of glory, of honor, of sons carrying their banners higher than their fathers ever could. But the truth was far darker. In feudal Europe, legacies weren't written in ink. They were carved in flesh and sealed in blood. To preserve a name, a title, a line, nobles did whatever it took. They married off daughters as bargaining chips. They raised sons to be soldiers before they learned kindness. And if a cousin or brother posed a threat to inheritance, he didn't get a second chance. He got a blade between the ribs or a hunting accident no one investigated. The line of succession was sacred, but sacred things in the Middle Ages were often drowned in violence. When a lord died without a clear heir, his lands didn't wait for a peaceful decision. They were torn apart. Brothers killed brothers, nephews turned on uncles, entire clans split into factions, and civil war became a family reunion soaked in betrayal. Even when succession was secure, it brought no peace. A young heir was a target, a widow with influence became a political pawn. Ambitious cousins lurked in the shadows, waiting for illness, for scandal, for any weakness they could exploit. Take the story of the Plantagenets, a dynasty that ruled England but nearly destroyed itself. King Henry II had 4 sons, and at different points in their lives, every one of them rose against him. His beloved son Richard the Lionheart rebelled. His youngest, John, later known as Lackland, would become king by outliving and outscheming his brothers, despite being despised by most of them. By the time Henry died, his kingdom was in pieces, and his sons had already drawn blood in the name of legacy. But this wasn't rare, it was expected. Feudal legacies were never peaceful. Because to preserve a name meant defending it with violence, or dying so your children might live to try again. Even in peace, the pressure of legacy was crushing. A lord's son couldn't be gentle. He had to be ruthless, decisive, politically shrewd. A daughter couldn't dream. She had to marry the man who would keep the estate intact, even if he was twice her age, or cruel, or already married to power. Legacy was not about love. It was about continuity at any cost. And yet, the irony, most of those noble names so viciously preserved no longer exist. The bloodlines that fought hardest to survive were often the ones that collapsed fastest, undone by their own brutality, internal treachery, or a single lost war. Their castles crumbled, their banners rotted, their names now footnotes in dusty tomes, because when your legacy is built on conquest and fear, it can't last, not truly. It may echo through history for a time, but history always has a way of swallowing even the loudest screams. So what remains? A pile of graves, a family tree scribbled in red, and a truth no lord dared admit aloud. Legacy doesn't preserve you, it consumes you. You might think it all ended with the fall of the castles, that when the stone keeps cracked and the banners were torn down, the age of the lords died with them. But look closer, listen not to the silence of ruined towers, but to the whispers in our modern halls of power. Because the game never ended, it just changed clothes. The names are different now, no longer de Montfort or von Habsburg, but Fortune 500, oligarch, politician, CEO. They don't ride on horseback or duel at dawn, but they still fight for territory. Only now the battlefield is boardrooms, courtrooms, screens glowing in the dark, and the weapons, information, influence, wealth. The power to decide who eats, who suffers, and who disappears. Today's lords don't rule by divine right, they rule by narrative control. They own the stories we're told, they fund the wars without marching. They shape policy without holding office. They build empires in silence, not from stone, but from data and debt. And just like in the feudal past, the cost is rarely theirs to pay. The modern peasants, the working class, the voiceless, the ignored still till the land, metaphorically and literally. They still make the goods, stock the shelves, clean the castles now called towers of finance. They still carry the weight of decisions made far above their heads. Only now, instead of paying taxes in grain, they give their hours, their privacy, their health. Just like before, alliances shift without warning. One day a partner, the next a rival. A friendly smile in front of cameras, a knife in the inbox, a hostile takeover instead of a siege. A character assassination instead of a sword through the ribs. And what of the legacy? Still just as fragile. Still just as blood-soaked, though the blood now flows in burnout, bankruptcy, depression, and exile. Dynasties still rise and fall. Families still tear themselves apart over inheritance, over power, over ambition. Because the truth is chilling, the Game of Thrones never stopped. It outlived the thrones themselves. It lives in the hunger for more land, more control, more name, more legacy. And beneath it all, still the same question whispered from medieval battlements to modern boardrooms: who will rule when I'm gone? So we look back on the feudal lords not with pity, but with recognition. They were brutal, yes, but also human, afraid of being forgotten, afraid of losing what they built, afraid of a world where power could slip away in the night. That fear hasn't changed. It just wears a suit now instead of chainmail. So remember this: as long as someone believes they were born to rule, the game will never end.